The Book of Eradan, Chapter 1. He peered out over the western horizon, and he could see the hobbit and his pony reaching the crest of the hill, then disappearing behind with which the Great East Road made its way west towards the last bridge and onward to Bree. Eradan now turned his head down and towards whatever remained of the dwarven merchants, and crouching down, felt the dirt with his hands. The cold of the previous night now made the ground impossible to dig quickly and easily, especially with the small trowel he had on his horse. Nodding his head, he stood up, went to his horse, who now was quietly standing, tied to a tree, eating some of the grasses nearby. Eradan grabbed his hatchet and proceeded to cut some trees and place them in a large circular pile. Most of the day was spent gathering the wood for the pyre, and once complete, he placed the bodies on top and proceeded to light the wood on all sides. The fire roared high and hot in the clearing, Eradan standing back and watching from a distance. The fire raged for hours, but Eradan stood, like a sentry on guard, throughout. As the last of the wood smoldered, the ground now warmed and loosed by the intense heat of the fire, he grabbed his trowel and proceeded to bury the ashes. Midnight it was when he was finished, and he set a small camp not far off. The night passed without incident, and after some of his prepared deer from his hunt earlier, and a drink from his waterskin, Eradan went back up to the troll hole. The troll's body remained where it was, but Eradan noticed some of the carrion eaters had already taken some of the meat off of it. The body was large for him to move, and it was best to let the wild reclaim it and do with it what it will. As for the hole, however, Eradan will make sure to make it hard for another troll, or anything else, to make its lair here. With what he had found available around the hole, and some work breaking some of the rock that was cracked along the walls and edges of the exposed bedrock, he wedged both rock and wood into the hole. And after 3 days and nights, he succeeded in closing, hopefully enough to deter anyone or anything to remove the wedged rock and other debris. Eradan's camp was away from the mound where the dwarves and ashes lay, and away from the rotting carcass of the troll. The small fire he had lit to stay warm filled the small hole made by an overhanging rock across one of the walls of bedrock that broke through. He stared into the fire, watching the flame weave back and forth, and reach out at times toward the rock ceiling. His mind now wandered through his thoughts as he pondered the words of the mother of the chieftain of the Dunedain, his people. Gilrea, daughter of Dirhahil, had been in council with the company of rangers with which Eradan was a part, advising that orcs have pressed a patrol of scouts further down towards the Great East Road from the north, so much so as to waylay unsuspecting and unprepared travelers. There was need for a scout to gather more information on the movements and the location of where these orc raiders are coming from. Eradan had long waited for such an opportunity, and despite the objections from some of the company of rangers that he wasn't yet ready to be on his own, he volunteered. Eradan had guessed the reason why they said such a thing, but trusted his instincts that Gilrayan would accept his offer of assistance to scout the northern lands west of the Horwell and north to the Ettenmoors. And she did accept his offer. He hadn't been gone 2 days on his journey when he happened on a small camp with a grazing pony just south of the Great East Road, on the northern edges of the angle. Now, 4 days on since Folco left for Bree, Eradan now looked northward, wondering what lay ahead. He hadn't ventured that far west or north of the Great East Road, having only been allowed to roam the lands between the Horwell and Loudwater, south of Rivendell, and the lands to the south. Now was his time to venture in the wilds alone, and he was intent on succeeding. The morning was dull. A slight fog rolled in from the north and blanketed the Trollshaws with a grey dreariness. Eradan had been used to such weather, and preparing his horse and securing his gear and provisions, he proceeded down to the Great East Road and rode west to the last bridge. Eradan had expected no traffic on the Great East Road, especially at this time of the year. He was pleasantly surprised that he had met Folco when he did, as the first snow of winter was soon at hand. Eradan wagered he'd be seeing his first sign of winter in the coming days as he rode north along the Horwell, on its western bank, as he made his way towards the Ettenmoors. He was prepared, as all rangers are, for the wilds. He had just hoped he was prepared enough. Crossing at the last bridge, he turned north and pressed on high up in the valley's edge overlooking the river. Taking little time to rest, he guided his steed over the many hills and groves of trees that covered the landscape. The old realm of Rudar was a foreboding place. The clouds now hung low, and on the summit of one of the hills Eradan could see the thick blanket of fog covering most, if not all, of the way northward. Eradan's face showed no sign of despair, however, and clicking his tongue, he pressed his horse to move forward. The fog was much denser than Eradan had hoped, and he soon found himself directionless as he traversed back and forth and around countless growths of the dark and crooked trees that made it impossible to drive his horse through. He stopped to rest and regain his bearings, hoping for any breaking of the thick fog to see the sky, the sun of the day, or the stars during the night. Better tidings welcomed Eradan when he happened on another lone ranger, shortly breaking from camp in the morning. Eradan joined him on the hunt for game, and the duo of rangers succeeded with relative ease. Orcs, Eradan. Yes, many orcs roam these lands of late. I have been able to keep a low profile, however. There has been occasion when I have happened on a scouting party, and as testament to me being here, survived it. Can't say the same for them. Any other man would have smiled at the statement, but not the ranger. Rangers know the dangers that lurk throughout the wilds, and orcs are not trivial, as some would make it out for one to believe. I am heading north towards the Ettenmoors, charged by Lady Gilran herself to bring back information on any new gatherings or movements of orcs. It's troubling to hear there is an increase. I wonder what has gotten them to once again band together. Eradan now helping with the preparation of the meat from the hunted animal. The other ranger continued. They do come generally from the north, and I've seen many a trail that would tell one so. Interestingly, there is also movement of men following the same routes. Looks like they have been, well, with captives of all sorts. Men, women, dwarves, and I dare say even hobbits, if you can imagine. Not sure where they're going, but north is direction. They continue to tend to the meat, and share more of their stories, the ranger more of the movement of the men of Bree, more orc trails, and Eradan told of the troll he and Folco fell not long ago along the Great East Road. Orcs and trolls, unsavory men. It has been a time that a threat of the north has endangered these lands, Eradan. We must find out more, lest this land, the people, or us, be lost to time forever, the ranger continued. Eradan bid his fellow ranger an offering of thanks and farewell as he mounted his steed and rode off once again northwards towards the arm of peaks and slopes of the misty mountains called the Ettenmoors. The day was unseasonably bright, sunny and warm actually. The land was still dreary, but a little less so. Eradan took the opportunity to try and dry out some of his outer wear as much as possible, given to the dampness he'd experienced now for the better part of 3 days. Unfortunately, despite the clear, view-unhindered skies, he still made no further away towards the North Mountains than normal. The next day resumed the common pattern of weather and field that Rudar was known for: cold, dreary, and dark, and poor visibility due to the low-hanging clouds and thick fogs. Eradan pressed on, however, more sure of his purpose than ever before. If he didn't succeed in bringing back information, who would? He couldn't let the others think he wasn't fit for such a task as this. Any respectable ranger was expected to be on his own, long alone in the wilds for weeks, if not months at a time. This was his chance to prove his worth, his skill, his valor. 5 days and close to 100 miles passed of rocky rolling hills of moors, dotted with ruins of the old Dunedain kingdom of Arnor, and more specifically of Rudar. When, whether by fate or by design, Eradan happened once again on a lone traveler, this time an elf out of Rivendell, sent by Lord Elrond to scout the far north past. The elf followed the trails of a band of orcs past the headwaters of the Horwell to here. There have been many orcs as of late, and Lord Elrond is pressed for more information. It has been a time since these many orcs have been seen so far south of the mountains. We are troubled to find out where they lurk, but the trail seems to lead north, possibly to Mount Graham, or beyond," said Eradan. Eradan had kept looking northward while the elf spoke. "I was headed this way, first under advisement by Lady Gilrayan, and then on a voice of concern from a fellow ranger I met a few days past. More orcs press further south to the road, even as far as near Amansul. Mount Graham seems the most likely of spots for sure." "I agree. I dare shudder at the possibility of them coming from further north. Let us hope that is not the case." Eradan nodded in agreement. After a light rest and sharing of food, the two departed ways. Eradan taking what was told of him by Eradan, heading eastward towards the Horwell. Eradan pressed further northward towards Mount Graham. The moorlands that made up the foothills of the Ettenmoors was now more thickly covered with a dense fog than the Eradan had experienced so far. Fortunately, the trails left by many of the orcs marching throughout were easy enough to follow, and considering their bearings, led to the direction of Mount Graham. The peaks of Ettenmoors broke through the low clouds that clung to the dark, craggy and menacing-looking mountains. Every ranger yet to go out in the wilds alone were advised to stay clear of the Ettenmoors, unless the need warranted such a venture. Eradan, charged by Gilrayan herself to find out as much as he could of the movement of the orcs, thought the need warranted such a dangerous exploration into these mountains. If there is a resurgence of building of orc horde, it must be found sooner rather than late. Now heading northwest along the south flank of the Ettenmoors, Eradan stopped his mount, and now gazed upon the ghastly, steep, and darkened peak that rose to the sky above all the other crags of the mountain range. Like a menacing, great-sized horn of a raging beast, the peak stood like a beacon of ill will to the world. Eradan knew this could only be the mountain called Graham. But it was still a trek and a climb up and over the rocky outcrops and mounds of fallen rock to get to its base. The weather held up for so far until now, where a blanket of darkened, grey clouds now sweeping over the range. Eradan tightened up his cloak around him and fixed his hood, keeping whatever cold out as much as possible. Sure enough, a cold rain mixed with snow started to rain down, making the path slippery and that much more treacherous. Through it all, however, Eradan now saw a mixture of orcish, but also tracks more akin to men, dwarves, and even the telltale sign of hobbit feet. Curious, he dismounted off his horse, and grabbing his sword, bow, and his quiver, and guiding his mount away from the current trail he was on. Hopefully his steed would be there when he returned, wherever there was. Now back on the trail he followed, keeping his profile quiet and low. The low visibility, constant falling of the rain and now snow, made it nigh impossible to gauge if he was still on the trail. Up and over, down and around he followed, spending the better part of whatever daylight he had left keeping to what he thought was the trail. A sense of disorientation, despair now passed over him as the realization of him being lost came across his mind. The seemingly cold and dark shadow that blanketed the mountains now seemed to envelop him, and deep into his soul, he hardly could shake it off. He pressed on, however, keeping on the move. The sun set now down behind some of the crags now to the west. Eradan trekked through deep cracks with rocks of the mountainside, up and over the rock debris from old and more recent falls. Cresting over a large boulder, just off the path, he spotted something unexpected. Within a relatively flat clearing below, surrounded by a natural rock wall, were pitched 6 small canvas tents with one larger tent to the far end. Eradan crouched low and against the rock, careful not to disturb any loose rock that may fall down the walls towards the clearing, alerting anyone in the camp of his presence. As he crawled closer, he was able to garner a better view of the scene. A large wooden pole seemingly from a cut-down tree had been driven down hard into the rock crevice in the middle of the encampment, where then a handful of men, women, dwarves, and hobbits had been chained up in all various states of postures and liveliness. A large fire was burning off to the side, closer to the large tent, and standing around it were 3 men. Eradan dared not move and waited, watching the comings and goings of the three. The larger, sturdier-looking man retired into the large tent shortly after, and others now taking turns keeping an eye to the fire and to the captive prisoners. Eradan watched for hours, making no movement. Suddenly, a large groaning sound came from under and below where Eradan was perched, overlooking the encampment. The sound now getting louder and louder, Eradan crawled up a bit further to get a better look. But suddenly and without warning, a number of rocks now broke free from just under him, now crashing and falling down into the clearing. The groaning now grew loud, and Eradan recognized it for what it was, a troll, a cave troll to be exact. It now lumbered out and stopped, the rocks now crashing down and falling on top of it. It seemed to Eradan to be unfazed by it. The lone man near the fire now walked over behind the tents and to where the troll now stood. The cave troll looked around and sniffed back and forth. Moog smell fresh meat. Is any for Moog? The cave troll now shouted out, its voice echoing throughout against the rock. Of course not. They're for the trade, you know that. All you get to do is guard them for the rest of the night, and keep that fire going this time, the man now said harshly to the troll. The troll made a loud sound, while the lone man retreated into one of the tents. The large cave troll slumbered over to the chained-up prisoners, all of them now looking extremely afraid and wary. What do you have? Men, women, dwarves, and children? Oh, good. Maybe Moog just have one for a snack. No one will miss. The troll now salivating from his open mouth. Hey! Shouted the man previously, now peering out from behind the tent. No eating the prisoners, especially the halflings. You remember the deal. The man now closed off the tent opening, Eradan hearing muffled curses from within. Deal, right. Moog remembers. But they look some tasty to Moog. Now the troll was poking at one of the hobbits. The hobbit now trying to, at best, they could move out of the way. The others stared and watched in silence, whether in terror or to not anger the troll. The troll now went and stood by the fire, throwing in a large log on top of it. Moog is hungry. Time to eat. The troll now sniffed and walked over to one of the tents, sticking his head in. Its arms followed, and after a short moment, it pulled out a large slab of meat. Eradan, unsure what it was from. Tasty pony. Moog like pony. It set up now near the fire, and skewing the meat with a large stick, he cooked it over the open fire, now burning high and bright. Eradan pondered his next moves. No way he was dealing with the likes of Troll and 3 men alone. Sure, he could take on the 3 men alone himself, he thought, but the Troll would prove too difficult alone, let alone with 3 others. He needed the Troll gone, and morning would be best before he would make his move to try and free the prisoners, and hopefully bring them out to safety. He now shut his eyes and rested as best he could, having trained himself for years to sleep as lightly as possible, just at the cusp of consciousness, ready at a moment's notice if danger lurked nearby. The morning weather was no better than the night. The rain and snow had stopped, but the cold lingered and the clouds still hung low to the surface. Eradan washed down some of the dried meat with a drink from his water skin and peered out over the edge. He saw his opportunity. It was just pre-dawn, and Eradan figured he may be 30 minutes before the light of day would brighten the area a little better. The troll now was gone. Eradan had awoken when it slumbered back down into the depths just below him. There was no sentry on guard. Eradan had seen none now for a brief time. The prisoners were all sleeping as well. The time was now, Eradan thought. Eradan carefully made his way down, not to slip on any of the ice now seemed to cover like a thin film over the rocks. Fortunately for Eradan, his boots remained grippy enough to be stealthily climbed down, and whether it was his skill on the frozen ice, no rock fell or made a noise like before. The camp was eerily quiet, with even the fire now essentially out, save for some smoldering of embers. Reaching the chained-up prisoners, he carefully and quietly awoke each, motioning them to stay silent as he did so. One by one they awoke, wide-eyed at the surprise of seeing someone other than the bandits and, of course, the troll. All awake, Eradan motioned to them with the hand gestures to follow the route back up and out of the encampment, as quietly as possible, after he sets them free. They all nodded in agreement, understanding the command. Eradan looked, and the chains were rusted and weathered, the locks themselves showing in a similar fashion. The ranger now carefully took out his longsword, and leveraging it appropriately, he was able to break one of the rocks. The sound of the metal breaking, muffled by the low clouds. Nothing stirred within the tents or caves, but one by one he broke the locks. Each now freed the prisoner, waiting until all were freed before moving. Eradan came to the last and labored at the lock. It snapped, and a large ring of metal snapped, echoed throughout the camp. What the? And from within the large tent, Eradan heard the grunting of a man and the movement of wood against the rock floor. 2 other men in the smaller tents now groaned. Eradan now stood up and motioned to the prisoners. Run! As he now took the stand, sword at the ready. The canvas flap at the large tent now swung open. Then the 2 smaller ones followed suit. Standing were 2 wiry men brandishing what appeared to be cudgels, wearing under their fur coats some form of leather. The middle man, taller, stockier, displaying a vivid scar from a burn, his only expression was that of a complete anger. Get him! Now ordering the others, as he pointed the head of the spear at Eradan. Eradan smirked, but then showed a more stern, calculated face. Having his sword up and high, keeping his leg back and ready for any oncoming attack from the bandits. He would strike hard and fast to the first to come, hoping to take them out and be left with 2, then engaging with the second before the dueling with the spear-wielding man, what Eradan assumed was the ringleader. The first of the bandits screamed and came to Eradan. Eradan's high stance provided him with the perfect position to come down hard and fast on the oncoming bandit, cleaving deep into his upper torso, breaking the bandit's clavicle and upper ribs, its body falling limp with a thud into the ground. Eradan lifted the blade back and up with a quick move across his chest, and parried the second bandit's attempt to bash him with the cudgel. Eradan felt a sharp and deep stabbing pain, however, deep into his exposed side, not having noticed the bandit leader closing the gap and spearing Eradan. Eradan let out a grunt of pain and shifted his stance now back and more guarded. The bandit, now holding the cudgel, swung the weapon down again, attempting to hit Eradan's head, Eradan weaving back into the side in response. Eradan attempted to capitalize on the bandit's unbalanced stance and swung the edge of the longsword against him, but whatever leather shirt the bandit wore took the brunt of the blow. The leader again struck deep into Eradan's back with the spearhead, Eradan arching his back in pain but still standing his ground. Eradan now focused his attention on the spear-wielding leader, and with the quick turn and swooping of his longsword with both hands, despite the large imposing figure before him, attempting to trip him with the butt of his spear, Eradan hit hard and deep across the bandit leader's midsection. The leader let out a cry of pain, winced and grimaced more, and in turn lurched forward to once again drive the head of the spear into Eradan. Succeeding once again, but fortunately for the ranger, his mail took the brunt of the damage, his skin and flesh bruised by the assault. The cudgel-wearing bandit tried to swing down again on Eradan, but missed completely as Eradan shifted slightly to dodge the blow. Eradan shuffled back, still focusing look in an opening to the bandit leader's stance. The leader, both hands wrapped around the spear, pulled back, and with that Eradan struck, driving the tip of his sword deep and into the chest. The bandit leader arched his back in severe pain, unable to scream in pain, as the air in his lungs were blown clear from the longsword of Eradan's attack. As quickly Eradan impaled the now dead man, he quickly pulled the sword out, and now was solely focused on the remaining bandit. The man dropped his cudgel, and kneeling before Eradan, raised his hands in surrender. Please, no, I was a prisoner, like them. Pointing off now to the handful of dwarves, men and women, and hobbits now climbing the rock walls surrounding the bandit camp. A large growl came from within the rock, the tunnel leading to the hole of the cave troll. Out lumbered Mo, now visibly anchored. Who goes there? And seeing Eradan, with the bandit now in surrendering position before him, and the prisoners all fleeing on the rock wall, the troll stomped towards the ranger. Boom! Here, Eradan tried to remember his name, then it came to him. Moog, take this intruder, and do with it what you will. I will go and reclaim our prisoners. Moog the troll now stopped, and a look of bewilderment came over him. Who? Wait. You're not Oswald. His look of bewilderment quickly again changed to one of muted anger. Oswald, that fool. He couldn't defend a stack of hay. Look at him. Eradan now motioned over to the bandit's body. See? Weak he was. I was sent to replace him. And then we were ambushed by these two. Eradan now motioned to the other, now motionless bandits. The other bandit now yelled out towards the troll. Mog! He's lying! He ambushed it! And before he could finish, Eradan swiftly punched the bandit, blood and teeth now flying out of his mouth. Shut up, you insolent roach! Mog, isn't that dumb? Now looking over at the troll. Mog is not dumb. Mog's smart. Now looking angrily at the bandit. Mog, listen to new leader. Mog, take intruder. Eradan stood firm as Mog came and stomped closer, bending down and grabbed the bandit by his left foot. Stop, Mog, stop! He's lying! He's the intruder! He killed Oswald! Pleaded the bandit to the troll, now dragging him towards the hole. Mog not fall for lies. Mog take care of intruder. Mog the troll now ducking his head under the rock ceiling of the tunnel and into the darkness, the screams of the bandit echoing throughout. Eradan let out a sigh of relief, but now a feeling of regret as he looked around and at his hands. They were trembling, bloodied, and cold. He looked around at the two now dead bodies of the bandit leader, Oswald, who now knew, and the other. It was the first time he killed a man, let alone two. A wave of regret came over him. He shook his head and focused to the task at hand. He looked over to the fleeing troop of people now on the top of the rock wall. Safe? He looked over to Oswald. Maybe there was some more information about what they were doing here, if he had just quickly looked. A loud scream and a cry of a man came from inside the cave tunnel. And Eradan knew once the troll was done with the bandit, there was nothing stopping the troll to come after Eradan. He quickly searched the bodies and found nothing of importance or value. Eradan looked over to the tent, and quickly running over, ramshackled the inside, and found a map. Rolling it up and placing it in the side of his mail, he proceeded out into the center of the camp. He grabbed a torch that was laying around, and lighting it against the smoldering embers of the center fire, he lit the tents, each bursting into flame. Throwing the torch into the fire pit, he quickly joined the fleeing former prisoners to guide them out of the shadow of Mount Graham and to safety. The Book of Eradan, Chapter 2. Eradan looked back towards the flattened area holding the handful of tents, now ablaze. The light from the fire gave the surrounding rock walls an eerie red-orange glow. The low-lying clouds obscuring whatever light came from the rising sun reflected the same. Eradan heard the voices of the now freed captives a little ways ahead of him. Whatever orc, man, or other creatures called this place home would surely see the bright light of the roaring fire, and come to investigate. Eradan nodded his head, and sheathing his sword, he quickly joined the others. Aye, look lads, our saviour is here, cried out one of the dwarves. Shush, we're not safe yet. Stay low, stay quiet, and keep up. We haven't much time. Follow me. Eradan walked quickly past the group, motioning now for the once captive mix of men, women, dwarf, and hobbit. They all nodded in agreement, and crouching as low as possible, save, mind you, the hobbits, they followed Eradan as he weaved around large boulders, sharp outcroppings of bedrock, and climbing up and down small rises in the ground. To any layman, it would appear he hadn't been following any trail or track at all, but for Eradan, having following the trail to the camp, the task was almost of second nature to him. He stopped, and signaling the others to hold up and stay out of sight, Eradan broke from the trail he was following. Cresting a small mound of granite rocks, he saw, to his utter surprise, his horse standing, licking up moss that was once covering the rock and whatever other vegetation it could find. Eradan smiled and calmly presented himself to his mount. A few minutes passed, and Eradan, now with his horse, returned to the group of freed captives. All of them were wide-eyed, not expecting a horse of all things to be here, let alone one in good condition. The journey will be a long one back to the East Road and onward to Bree. That's where I'll bring you. Where you go from there, that is your choice. You'll take turns on the horse. The pace must be quick. Winter is soon upon us. and we have no time to spare. Eradan now eyes each of them, assessing their presumed strength and stamina. He motioned to one of the women and one of the hobbits looking to be more worse for wear than the others, and after helping both onto the mount, guided now the unlikely to have company, as anyone could have imagined, down and away from the shadows of Mount Graham. Hours had passed, with Eradan leading the group, who now saw themselves at the foothills of the high moors that stretched out to the north, west, and south, making up at once the lands of Rudar. The weather remained cold, damp, the clouds laying low and close. Finding a suitable place for the evening, Eradan set up camp, and ensuring all was safe in whatever small provisions Eradan had, the others ate and rested as best they could for the evening and into the next day. Eradan slept lightly, knowing that these lands were not safe from harm. Any form of beast or orc could be roaming the lands, especially at night. He had heard rumors of brigands, Northmen that roamed the former lands making up Rudar, raiding as far south as the East Road in unsuspecting caravans. He looked back at the sleeping party, all huddled around a low-burning fire. He never suspected he'd be escorting this many so far into the wilds. He returned his gaze out to the darkness of the night, keeping eye and ear ever at the ready for the slightest of movement or sound. Morning came, and the party of dwarves, men, women, and the handful of hobbits awoken to the unsuspecting warmth of the sun rising from the east and onto their faces. I did not know we would have missed the sun so much, but it feels like an eternity since I felt the warmth of it in my face, one of the hobbits had said. The others were now looking around. The men, the women, were consoling each other, all having a feeling of surrealness of where they were and where they currently are. Eradan was standing on the high rock, looking out into the distance, panning the horizon. A few moments passed, and he jumped and climbed down to the group, sitting now around the fire. We must get moving. We're still too close to the mountains and the shadows of Mount Graham. This land does not favor the sun for long, and orcs will be roaming. Eradan now set out some of the last of his preserves, just enough to hand out to each. Looking back out to the horizon, and as he secured his pack on his horse, he wondered what the next leg of the journey would present. He would guide the group south across the wildlands of Rudar towards the Weather Hills, then down to the East Road, past Amansul, and on to Bree. Hopefully, if all goes well and the fortune experience so far continues, the journey to the Weather Hills would take 8 to 9 days to reach, and then another handful south to the Great East Road. From there, past Amansul to Bree, another 4 to 5 days. Altogether, Eradan wagered the journey would take 15 or 16 days. He looked back at the now gathered group of men, women, dwarves, and hobbits. Despite their wearied and miserable look of their clothes and demeanor, their faces showed renewed hope from the warmth of the sun. Eradan nodded to them, turned, and then proceeded on a southwesterly direction. Days passed, and despite the warm, clear, and favorable conditions, Eradan was unable to take advantage of the good weather. The group labored to keep pace with the ranger, and Eradan was forced to make frequent stops, find alternate paths around natural outcroppings of rocks, or the remains of the ruins of the kingdoms long since past that dwelt here. The 6th day since leaving the shadows of Mount Graham, Eradan set up a small camp on the crest of a large hill that gave a surprisingly serene and peaceful view, a vista giving him an unobstructed panoramic view of the surrounding country. To the northwest, he could see the still visible, foreboding, darkened peak of Mount Graham, and the Ettenmoors reaching out east towards the distant Misty Mountains. To the west was just within sight of his eyes, crested on the horizon, was the Weather Hills, rolling ever north and south. Then he spotted, whether by chance or by fate, the small outline of the ruins of Amansul. They were still a number of days' travel away, but both Eradan's and the group's spirits and resolve were renewed. A day passed, and while Eradan scouted for a suitable camp for the evening, Eradan was greeted with a welcoming sight. The ranger, Baranor, who he had met just north of the Great East Road on his way to scout Mount Graham a little over 2 weeks ago, greeted him with a fresh game and open arms. "We meet once again, Eradan, under a favorable sky this evening," Baranor said, holding out his hand and arm. Eradan smiled, and clasping his hand around Baranor's forearm, Baranor followed suit. They both embraced each other in greetings,
and in kingship. Favorable indeed. It is good to see you once again, friend. Eradan now stepping back and looking over Baranor. Have you fared well since our last we met? Baranor looked at Eradan and over his shoulder, behind the group now of men, women, dwarves, and hobbits. Well, and uneventful, unlike what I see you've come across since. Eradan turned around to look at the group standing a number of yards behind, they all now looking over at the two rangers in conversation. Yes, well, it seems my journey has been a little more complicated than yours. More pleasantries were passed between Eradan and Baranor, and an offering by their other ranger of fresh game for eating was made. The rangers with the group of free captives sat and heard the story of Eradan's journey to Mount Graham, the events at the bandit encampment, and from the escape to now. Baranor was amazed. You have for assuredly proven your valor and worth this day, my friend. What are your plans now? Baranor spoke with a reserved tone. Eradan, after taking a drink from his waterskin, I'm making to Amansul and then onto the east road to Bree. So far, the trek has been favorable, and we've kept clear of any orc or other patrol that I can attest to. There were more tents than men I fought there at the camp. Gives me warrant to know more of those men are out there. Once they find what happened, I'm sure they'll be on the hunt. But we've got days ahead of them. At least I hope so. Maybe the troll will help hinder any progress they would have in finding us. The evening passed and Baranor bid Eradan to rest and sleep, build up his strength for the rest of the journey. He'll stand on watch for the night. And so Eradan found himself a quiet hole off to the side and fell into a deep and restful sleep. Morning came and the group was welcomed by Eradan, now tending to the remains of the fire, ensuring as little as possible remained of their presence. It was a difficult task, mind you. As for it was he himself alone, it was easy to cover one's tracks and trails. However, for this hodgepodge of free peoples made the task much more difficult. What happened to the other ranger? Wouldn't he help us get to Bree? Asked one of the men, now looking surprised, confused, and a little less sure of their situation. Eradan, while securing the straps and supplies onto his mount, looked over to the man. No, Baranor has other matters to attend to. Don't be troubled. We will make it safely to Bree. Eradan gave him a smile, nodded, and then turned to peer over to the lands now presenting to him by the rising of the sun to the east. The sun shone across the weather hills, now a mere 50 miles from where the party led by Eradan were. The barely visible ruins of the watchtower of Amansul glistened in the morning sun. Eradan smiled. He turned and bid the group to get ready, and soon moved out. Favor again was on their side. The relatively pleasant late autumn and early winter weather changed, and gray, melancholic clouds rolled in from the north. A chilled breeze blew down over the weather hills and onto the group, which fared much worse now than they ever had, huddling up as close as possible while still making progress south. Eradan gave what blankets he and his heavy cloak he had to the women and men. The dwarves and hobbits seemed to be faring much better to his surprise. Although Eradan was chilled, he felt his home in this environment as much as sitting around a warm hearth and a mug of ale. He pressed on, and the group eagerly followed. 3 days passed since the meeting with Baranor, somewhere east of the Weather Hills, when the shadow of Amansul cast a darkness across the dell in the valley to the east, and finding a small cluster of trees along an adjacent hillside, he set camp for the night. One of the hobbits spoke up as the fire was being lit by one of the men, with aid from one of the other dwarves. At first, Eradan had done most of the preparing of camp, setting the fire, gathering edible plants, and the like. But now, more than halfway through their journey back to Bree, a routine had set in, each helping out in some form or fashion, in preparing or breaking camp. The women started to prepare food for the evening and morning meals. The men gathered wood for the fire, the dwarves prepared areas for rest, the hobbits foraged for whatever berry, herb, or root they could find. Eradan ever was on the watch, scouting ahead and hunting when he could. For a second there, Eradan almost thought you'd take us to Weathertop and stay there. Was worried, what with those ghosts and all, said one of the hobbits. Oh, don't be so foolish. Old tales to scare the children to sleep, that's all, responded another. One of the dwarves piped up. Ah, lad, Would have to agree with the half-lad. There be no ghost there, just bandits watching and waiting for one of our caravans to come up unguarded. They're not there at all time, but they're there more often than not, I tell you. Slit you in your sleep, they will. Take your worth, leaving you to bleed dry. Eradan thought about the dwarves he placed to rest back at the Trollshaws, found by Folco on his journey on the East Road, but thought it was unwise to mention it while they were still far from the safe haven of Bree. No harm will come of you this night, Eradan now interjected. That being said, no need to disturb what haunts these hills. Rest up, we're not out of the woods yet. It's still a 6-day journey before we reach the hedged walls and hills of Bree. Eradan grabbed some food and, making sure everything was set for the evening, went off again in the shadows of the night. Yarano, I once thought the rangers were unsavory folk, but this one, he's warming on me, said one of the other dwarves. Well, I sure hope so, but after he rescued you and us from the horrible southerners, can you imagine where we'd be right now? I shudder to think of it, said one of the women, now sitting down with some food in their hands. The rest of the evening, the group bantered back and forth, and after a short while, all was quiet, and they rested peacefully as one could in the wilds north of the Great East Road. Eradan, like a gargoyle, perched on top of a large boulder, seemingly placed on the high hill by a giant, listened and looked like a sentry, ready for any trouble that may come their way. They reached the Great East Road just east from the Weathertop, and the ruins of what was once called Amansul. The name lost to history, really only remembered by the last of the Dunedain and scholars who cared to know about it. Commoners called the tower Weathertop, for that was the name given to the hill. Eradan kept up a good pace past the tower and what was left of the crumbling stone archway that once greeted the travelers along the road. Eradan stopped and touched the stone archway, observing a moment of remembrance as he, under the grey light of the now clouded sky, felt and examined the images of Elendil and Isildur, carved into the weathered stone. The other stopped a distance behind him. "What is he looking at now?" murmured one. "Oh, probably some trace of some bandit marks. This whole land is their playground," responded another. Eradan smiled, and then proceeded to lead the group onward, west towards Bree. An hour passed, and as the sight of Weathertop and the watchtower of Amansul faded into the low-hanging clouds in the distance, Eradan stopped and motioned for the group to take cover off the road. Eradan wasn't sure what he heard, but he heard something nonetheless. He waited and listened, scanning the road and the growth of trees now flanking the south of the road. Eradan listened for the slightest of sounds, and suddenly, hearing a call of that of a land fowl. To most, they would chalk it up to normal fauna of the woods, a bird like no other. But to a seasoned and trained hunter or ranger of the north, the call was not something one would hear here, nor expected during this time of the year. Eradan smiled and responded with his own call, similar but with a slightly different pitch. Another call came from across the road, and Eradan motioned to the others to hold their ground, but not to worry. Presenting themselves from the shadows of the trees were the 3 rangers of the north, now walking towards Eradan and the party of men, dwarves, and hobbits. Eradan stood now in kind, greeting the 3 in good fashion. The group now looked on from the side of the east road, while the now 4 rangers stood to the side conversing with one another. Eradan spoke of their journey from Mount Graham, the encounter with the bandits, the freeing of the captives now here with him, and the charge from Lady Gilrayan to scout north to the Ettenmoors for information on orc movements. The rangers all eagerly listened and warned Eradan of an ever-increasing presence of southerners, ruffians along the road east, south, and north of Bree, of orc scouts north of Amansul and the Weather Hills to the lands of the old kingdom of Angmar. I don't know what to make of it, but if word has reached Rivendell of this, and Gilrayan and Elrond are increasing the watch, this does not bode well for this land. If what you say is true, and there is a presence of evil building near or in Mount Graham once again, I fear for all within these very lands. It has been a time since an army marched from here, and I doubt there is much strength left now amongst any of us to hold one at bay. the eldest of the rangers had said to Eradan. Eradan nodded his head in agreement. Once I safely bring them to Bree, I will make my way to Fornos and east to Mount Gran. I need to bring as much as I see back to Gilrayan to Rivendell before my task is complete. Eradan now looked past to the rangers and to the group. Fortunately, no bandits will trouble you back to Bree, with winter soon to settle in, and the mountain passes all but closed off due to the snow. Not much for bandits to rob, but their own ambitions, one of the other rangers noted. Saying their goodbye and watching the trio of rangers slip off into the trees and out of sight, Eradan bid the group to follow, now along the east road towards Bree. Days passed, and despite the road sitting high enough to be free of the damp and boggy ground of the mid-water marshes, the miles of road was difficult to navigate nonetheless. With each footstep, the ground, which should have been hardened from the now cold and frost-laden air, seemed to envelop and pull down each of the party. The hobbits had a particularly hard time, and much help was needed to get them unstuck, Eradan promptly sitting them on the horse for this leg of the journey. A long day was had traversing the ground, and each and every one of the party, although not physically exhausted, felt the darkness of their dreams and shadow had befallen them. The eastern borders of the Chetwood now rose over the horizon, and as Eradan and the party crested on the last hill before reaching Bree, a handful of miles away, the smoke from the many chimneys of the village blanketed the valley. A sigh of relief waved over the party, and now everyone, save for the Eradan himself, was eager to get to the hedge, past the south gate, and into their homes or at the prancing pony. Eradan escorted them back, but a handful of miles or so away from the eastern wall of the hedge. I bid you peace and safety. My time with you is done. Eradan now spoke to the group. A sense of surprise came over each of the rescued, now eagerly awaiting to get to Bree. A series of thank yous, handshakes, hugs, and commitments to rewards were offered to Eradan, but he graciously accepted none. The ranger's oath to protect the land and the free peoples that dwell within it he held dearly, and therefore no reward was necessary. Watching as they progressed down and towards the hedge, Eradan now looked northward and to the Chetwood, grabbing supplies from Archit. He'd make his way north along the North Greenway and to the once great city of stone, for he had heard of the former glory of Fornost and tales spoken to all rangers, young and old. Now turning back to see the group of men, women, dwarves, and hobbits reach the southern gate of the hedge, Eradan mounted his horse and proceeded north and in to the darkened forest of the Chetwood. Book of Eradan, Chapter 3. A small layer of snow blanketed the tops of the trees making up the Chetwood, the flakes of snow finding it hard to reach the forest floor, where Eradan, now following a lone path from the Great East Road, winding its way through and up to the small hamlet of Archit. Unlike most who enter the forest of the Chetwood, Eradan kept his ranger senses keen and ever aware for the slightest of movement, subtle signs of covered trails or tracks, anything that may indicate danger. Although close and frequently visited by hunters and foragers from Bree, Staddle, Combe, and Archit itself, the Chetwood was as old as any of the wood throughout Middle-earth, and dangers lie hidden all around. Archit was quiet, like it always had been, the occasional sound of chopping or sawing of wood, and the low neighing of the various beasts of burden, pulling carts full of packed wood and lumber heading off towards Bree. Eradan entered the village proper without fanfare from the handful of Archit residents, barely acknowledging his presence, and Eradan was okay with this. Reaching the Green Fletcher Inn, Eradan tied up his horse and walked in. "Find yourself a seat, I'll be with you," the innkeeper half-heartedly spoke from behind the small bar. Eradan noticed they hadn't looked up towards him, and scanning the room, no other patrons were present. Eradan noticed the hanging specimens along the walls, and sitting down towards the back and near the fireplace, looked at the closest set of antlers, and let out a slight chuckle and a grin. "Well, Folco, you sure leave your mark wherever you go." Eradan pulled back his hood and set his sheathed sword within arm reach of him. "Well, what have you?" The innkeeper, now standing across from Eradan, Eradan noticed a sense of confusion, wondering what to make of him. Ale, and whatever you have cooking in the pot. That's all that's needed. Eradan nodded and then motioned to the set of antlers hanging on the wall behind him. And this? What is this for? The innkeeper looked and then motioned around the room. Official record of the hunt. That one there? Well, just new from last week. Surprised we were, being a hobbit and all. Came in barely being able to carry it. Eradan looked back at the antlers and again smiled, now turning his head back to the innkeeper. Well, he is full of surprises. Eradan now taking off his gloves and laying them back on the table. The innkeeper now with even a further puzzled look towards Eradan. Ah, so you know Folco, eh? The innkeeper continued to eye Eradan, but with less of a puzzled look and more intrigued. That I do. Well now, about that food and drink? Eradan curtly asked. Yes, well, it won't be long. The innkeeper gave a slight smile and shuffled to the kitchen. Eradan turned around again and looked back at the antlers brought back by Folco. He turned and looked towards the fire and sat back into the chair and waited. Eradan left Archit the same as he entered, with little fanfare or awareness that he was even there. He proceeded northward towards to what the locals called the Dead Man's Dyke, but to all rangers, it was Fornos, Eradan, the once great ancestral center of the Dunedain, before the destruction at the hands of the Witch King of Angmar. Eradan had a sense of anticipation, hearing of the great city of stone, but never seeing it, as he galloped on his horse along the rolling hills and glades, as the great forest of the Chetwood thinned out. Eradan passed many homesteads that dotted the land surrounding the village of Bree, some seemingly seeing much better days than before now. By the second day, the last signs of any Greenlander faded, and the wild areas and boundaries of the North Downs was coming into view. Eradan found himself a suitable place to camp, hidden within a cleft of bedrock in a well-sheltered shallow valley. Fortunate to not have seen any signs of ruffians or other ill-intended creatures like orcs, goblins, or the like. Morning of the third day to Fornost, Iran, he spotted a peculiar path leading out of the valley, and without his careful eye trained by the experienced rangers with which he learned his craft, he wouldn't have spotted it. But the telltale signs of marks signaling a path frequently used by his brethren marked a path through the wilds, heading north toward the old city. Eradan felt fortunate of his finding, and the sense of dread in the encroaching shadow within his mind appeared to dissipate, and the light of his was a little brighter. Eradan followed the path northward, never losing sight of the markers, left only to be seen by the most trained eye of the rangers. Any other would not have noticed, unless they too were taught the ways. Miles he traveled north. The weather was fair, the sun hung low in the sky, the wind, although chilled, ever so slightly. By later afternoon of the fourth day, low, gray-black clouds rolled in from the north, and Eradan felt the cold, bitter winds now blowing harder down and through the valley. Eradan quickly found a place for the night, out from the bitter winds and blowing snow, the fire he did manage to light barely giving off any appreciable heat. The night was not restful, for Eradan didn't know if it was the now raging blizzard he found himself in, or the darkness that was slowly encroaching the lands of late. Visions and thoughts of hopelessness, disaster, ruin came over him. He hadn't felt this way before, and it was being so far from the angle and his family that caused it so? Or was some power here trying to corrupt his mind? He wrapped himself further into his heavy, fern-lined cloak and threw more wood into the fire, now staring into the red, yellow, and orange flame, hoping the light would push out the darkness. What little rest he got, he hoped it was enough to keep going. The storm passed on and left a heavy blanket of fresh snow throughout the land. The winds had died down, the clouds lifted slightly, but still the grey black of the sky remained. The air was still and silent. Eradan secured his gear on his horse and guided his horse out of and northwards. His horse now bucked and neighed in fear, seemingly sensing something not well with where they were. Eradan tried his best to calm the horse down, and when he saw what spooked his horses so much, the blood in his body seemed to have drained out like that of water rushing over a high fall. Although the Dunedain have no special senses to feel the passing of kin, the feeling that now overwhelmed him brought forth darkness and sorrow. What evil was in the land, darkened the entire place, and what shadows were in the valley in which Eradan found himself in were long and dark, the air bitterly cold. A thin blanket of snow obscured most of the body he saw, with only the leather boots showing out just enough for him to see. He brushed away what snow was there, and suddenly he felt the urge to vomit wave through his abdomen. As he turned his head away, holding it back, covering his mouth with his gloved hand. A moment passed, the urge faded, and he turned his head back. The body of a slain Dunedain lay before him, mutilated, almost unrecognizable if it weren't for the brooch, in the shape of a rayed star, loosely held the mangled cloak together. Eradan studied the body, adjusting for the previous blizzard, the bitter cold. Eradan thought that the ranger had succumbed to his wounds only a handful of days earlier. Eradan paused and thought if only he had pushed the group faster from Mount Graham, cutting the trip back to Bree by a few days, he may have been here to thwart whatever killed the Dunedain now laying here, lifeless. The wounds showed the telltale signs of orcs, deep, serrated cuts, and a shaft from a crudely made orcish arrow. Eradan closed his eyes for a number of moments, and upon opening them, he now had the small brooch in his hands. Nothing he could do for his brother now, and a sense of sorrow again came over Eradan, the last of the Dunedain dwindling further and further. Eradan stood, more resolved than ever now, to reach Fornas Iran, and then across the hills of the North Downs and east towards Mount Graham. The charge given to him by Lady Gilraen to find whatever he could of any orcish movements must be completed. If orcs are further venturing this close to Bree, and worse, the Shire, nothing good would come, Eradan thought. The ground was now too frozen to properly bury the body. Eradan had no choice but to leave for the wilds to reclaim. Pocketing the brooch, he would return to the home of the rangers and find out who this ranger was, for he could not recognize or remember who it is. Eradan continued north, and after a number of miles, the ruined walls of Fornas Iran, barely visible with the accumulated fresh snow, came into his view on the horizon. Eradan entered the ruined city, what was left above ground at least. The hands of time have ravaged the abandoned city, destroyed by the invading Witch King and his forces from Angmar, now almost 1,000 years ago. If it weren't for the fading memories and dwindling numbers of the Dunedain, and the handful of elvish lore masters, few would recall the history of the once capital of Arnor, and later Arthedain. Every ranger knew of the ill-fated last of the Númenórean kings of the sea, Arvedui, after the fall of Fornas and Arthedain, lost his life in the frozen ice bay of Foreshell. Fornas Iran was a sacred place, and it was every ranger's charge, if near it, to protect the pass as much as possible, waiting for the day that the return of the king would come and bring honor and glory back into this ancient realm. Eradan pressed into the ruins, now dismounted, guiding his horse through the maze of deep snow, broken walls and ruin, and twisted trees. Although the Witch King was ultimately defeated by the last alliance of elves, men, and even hobbits, a millennia ago, Eradan continued, the winds of the north now howling in eerie sound through the many protruding clusters of ruined walls and statues of the once great walled city. More and more the sound howled, the winds blistering and cold. He tightened his cloak more around him with one hand while holding the reins of his horse in the other. Without warning, a large crack and a shudder from underneath his feet he felt, and slowly, like that of sands in an hourglass, the snow started to fall into a newly made hole, and he along with it. Eradan gathered his wits and quickly dug himself out of the piled snow that now buried him into a darkened chamber. Gathering his bearings, Eradan stood and looked at what and where he fell into. What grey light from the outside came in made visible to Eradan a vast chamber, which nature, until now, had not yet broken through completely, its large stone walls and large tall pillars that supported the semi-dome ceiling. Eradan marveled at the architecture, never before seeing such a wonder created by men before. Even the halls of Rivendell paled in comparison to its beauty and workmanship. Whatever craft and stone masonry that had built this now long since been forgotten to the passing of time. Eradan eyed, now fully adjusted, spotted the long, high pedestal in the far end of the hall, with which then sat a large throne. As he carefully walked further towards it, carefully navigating the maze of fallen stone and debris on the floor, he spotted the image of a single, mini-rayed star, the high marble back with which it was unseemingly untouched by the passing of time. Eradan pulled out the small brooch from the fallen ranger he had saw earlier, and the resemblance was the same. He stood near the marbled stone throne and placed his hand on the star underneath his breath. Is this the throne of Arvadui, last of the kings out of the sea? His thoughts of remembrance now shifted to puzzlement. How was he to get out of here? The hole in the ceiling created the fall into the chamber was some 30 feet high or so. He could hear his horse quietly neighing above, and the rope he did have was securely strapped to the saddle. No good that did him. He looked around the room for whatever doorways that would have lead out and or into the hall, but whether by design or by time, all the entrances were blocked with piles of stone and other rubble. Not all was lost, however, as he stumbled upon a relatively large sealed box, and upon carefully opening the lid, found a number of surprisingly preserved maps. What light of the day availed of him, he saw the map showed of places of the old kingdom, of Arthedain and Arnor. Eradan smiled, and realizing the importance of such a find, and carefully placing it in his pack, he would ensure it was safely taken back to Rivendell, to Lady Gilraen. Surprise came over Eradan as a voice came from above, and with it a length of rope down into the hall. "Come, I'll pull you up," a man yelled from above, and although he could not make out the features of his would-be help, save for the silhouette of the cloak about him, Eradan knew he wasn't meaning ill of him. Grasping the rope, and within moments Eradan was up and on the outside, now staring face to face with another Ranger of the North. "I wasn't expecting another of us to be here, this late in the year. The name's Talendil, and I've been on watch over this place for many years. What brings you?" Talendil, his tall and imposing frame square to Eradan, reached out his hand in greetings. Eradan reached out his hand in return, embracing it as he would any other member of the Rangers. "I am Eradan, and on a charge from Lady Gilraen herself to scout the northern borders of our reach and bring back whatever knowledge I can of orc or other evils that try to venture further in. I've come now from the Chetwood, after delivering a handful of captive free peoples from Mount Gran, and I am to return there to finish my task and then back to Rivendell." Talendil stepped back now and motioned Eradan to follow him, now guiding him around and out of the ruins of Forest Eradan. "I'm not going to lie, Eradan. I had hoped that Gilraen would have heeded my ask for more men, to help reclaim these lands as we once had, as Southerners have pushed us further and further south and to the east. If what you say is true, that orcs and others are increasing their numbers near Mount Gran, I too share the fear that some nefarious plot builds that would do us ill." Talendil, saying solemnly. Eradan nodded. "I am afraid I have other news. I found this on one of our own, neck just south of here. Maybe you knew who it belonged to." Eradan removed the small brooch from his belt pouch and handed it over to Talendil. Talendil looked at it, the mini-rayed star, and took in a deep sigh. "I had not heard from Adrahil for some time, and this was his. Our numbers are getting too thin, Eradan. We may not be able to protect this region much longer. Do you know what had slain him?" Talendil solemnly saying to Eradan and pocketing the brooch. "Orcs, I'm afraid. And not 2 or 3 days, no more than a week earlier," said Eradan. "Orc? This far south, and at this time of year? These tidings do not bode well at all, Eradan. And with one less to us to guard this place in the North Downs, I fear for whatever free peoples reside here." Talendil, now at one of the ruined outer gates of the north wall, turned now and looked at Eradan. "Come, let us rest for the evening, and set you on your journey back to Mount Gran and then to Rivendell. I will tell you more of what is happening here, and then with your charge advise Gilraen of the same. Maybe with her counsel, more can be done." Eradan nodded his head in agreement. Farewell, Eradan, and make haste. Their winter will not be kind, I'm afraid. Talendil motioned to Eradan as he turned and left back into the city. Eradan responded in kind and then turned to face the wild of the North Downs, a rolling landscape of intermittent rocky outcroppings, scattered trees and open glades. Snow, which was to stay now until spring, covered the ground, and Eradan was thankful he had his trusted mount. Having studied the maps found in the chamber earlier, and with Talendil's aid, Eradan figured he'd reach the north boundary of the North Downs in 4 days, then turn east and to Mount Graham in 9, weather and fortune permitting. Rangers of the north were prepared as any to brave the wilds, even in the most inclement of weather, but caution was always to be had. He would only push himself as far as he reasonably could. The clouds were dark and grey, and a chill wind blew from the north. Eradan hoped for the winds to change, but that would not be his fate. By midday, snow started to fall, and visibility was at a minimum, and his progress moved to a snail's crawl. The winds blew hard, the snow cutting deep into his clothing. His horse labored with the now ever-increasing snow. It seemed all evil was bent on holding him back and never to move forward. Finding what he could within the confines of a handful of old, wind-bent trees, he stopped and dug out what he could a resting spot. Nestled against his mount, he slept as best one could given the howl of the winds, the bite of the cold, and the wetness of the ever-falling snow. Morning came, and with it the passing of the storm. Eradan and his horse had been buried in snow, but not enough to cause issues with breaking free of it. He was but a handful of leagues north of Fornoss-Iran, and Eradan was dismayed at the progress he had made so far. With the fairer weather, he had hoped to make up the loss of time. He pushed ahead, northwest, through the downs. The snow remained deep, and begrudgingly his horse waded through the snow. Fortunately for Eradan, his horse, although not the most of strength, fared well due to its light stance and relative weight. The horse suddenly stopped and pulled back, turning around quickly. Eradan held on tightly, almost losing grip and balance and falling off. He calmed the steed, and then when he looked to see what set it off, he now noticed it. Eradan now found himself at the edge of a deep and unexpected ravine, the edges obscured by the white snow, the lack of appreciable sunlight making it harder to see. He patted down the horse in thanks, and proceeded along the ravine edges a number of yards to the side, not chancing a fall into a sudden crack in the rock or loosening footing and falling into it. The boundary to the north end of the downs was marked by the sudden cut of the tree line, the expanse of the lowlands to the north looking flat, desolate, with the occasional grove of gnarled, twisted, and bent trees breaking up the monotony. Not with a handful of men would Eradan traverse the land at this time, for the old kingdom of Angmar, under the power of the Witch King, soured the land, and the evil and darkness still permeates it. Eradan turned his attention now eastward, and towards Mount Graham of the Ettenmoors. The way was extreme, with days of cold, bitter winds blowing from the northlands, periods of blinding snow and large sky reaching drifts, slowing his progress. Eradan pushed through, finding resolved in the charge given him by Lady Gilraen to find the information and bring back to her to Rivendell. He would ensure that the task was done. On and on he continued, stopping for rest periodically, always keeping to the move, through the snow and the bitter winds. Fortune seemed to favor him as he neared the foothills of the Ettenmoors, Mount Graham now within 2 days' ride, signs of orcs and hillmen from Rudar encampments not that long ago. Trails now leading from the north to the east and towards the mountain. Eradan took note of where this was in his mind, and he continued on. The sun on the 8th day rose low over the misty mountains to the south, unable to warm the winds now continuing to blow from the north. Eradan's provisions of breads, dried meat, and the like were now dangerously low. He prepared his bow and kept an ever-keenful eye on any signs of wild game to be had. Hours passed, and fortune once again favored Eradan, as he spotted and felled some large hares, with thick fur, heavy meat, and fatted bellies. By evening, the meat was prepared, and fur and skin now removed and tied to the saddle. Eradan ate well, and for the next day he would reach Mount Graham, and, needing all the strength he could will, for who knows when he would have a well-prepared meal again. Eradan now peered out over the now charred remains of the bandit camp he had helped destroy a little less than a month ago, and noticing no signs of activity or attempts to rebuild. What of the troll Moog? He could not tell. The opening to its cave bare, no noise to be heard. He pulled out the ragged map he had pulled off the would-be leader's body and studied it, and noted a number of paths leading up and into the mountain. Taking mental note, he tucked it away and proceeded. Although rangers brave the wilds of Eriador alone, there are times when having a close companion near you is most welcome. Eradan felt that the time was now, but he took in a deep breath, swallowed, and bravely moved forward. Slowly he traversed the maze of hills, gullies, and gorges at the immediate foothills of the mountain, at times having the foreboding sense that he had turned back on himself and reached the same place not just twice but multiple times before. A sense of ill will with loss and dread came over him. But the words of his people, the charge from Gilran, and the seeing of the many-rayed star and the throne of Arvedui pushed back the encroaching darkness into his mind. He pressed on, using his senses to guide his path forward. Hours passed, but he was making progress, now finding himself in a narrow gorge, when suddenly, and without warning, Eradan heard the sudden and loud sound of cracking and breaking rock, and as he looked up, huge boulders and large rocks and other debris fell towards him, bouncing and breaking off the walls of the ravine. Eradan's heart sank, and taking in a deep breath and covering his head, he jumped.